Hello, I'm Eduardo Gonçalves from the Climate Group, and welcome to Climate TV, a brand new initiative from the Climate Group in support of this year's Climate Week NYC. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking to leaders from the world of government, business, and civil society, and exploring some of the key issues around climate change and the low carbon economy. Speaking to me today is the CEO of the Climate Group, Mark Kenber. Mark, so are we going to see a deal in Paris later this year? And if so, is it going to be the right deal?
Well, I'm absolutely confident that we'll have a new agreement in Paris. It'll be an agreement that's very different from what was envisaged in past climate negotiations, and that it will build on what national governments are committing to through their intended nationally determined contributions and aggregate them. And that leads to the second question. Will it be effective? Will it be as good as we want? Well, on current showing, the answer is clearly no. If our objective is to keep global emissions within an acceptable carbon budget, 1 trillion tonnes since the beginning of the industrial age, where we are at the moment, we'll not do that. And therefore, we'll reduce our chances of keeping global temperature increase below 2 degrees to a very, very low level. So, but I think that's not the only optic we need to look at it through. This, although this has been said many times before, is a starting point, a turning point. What we mustn't think is, okay, Paris has got an outcome, we can all go back to doing business as usual. What's important about Paris is that it signals to all sectors of the community, all parts of the economy, investors, business leaders, financiers, politicians, that we are now on the road to a low carbon economy, something that the Climate Group has been advocating for well over a decade. And that'll happen because people see not only is it desirable, but it's viable and financially attractive.
Climate Week this year is taking place just 10 weeks or so before all the negotiators gather in Paris for the climate talks. What's going to be the message going out from Climate Week this year to those negotiators?
As in all climate weeks, but even more importantly this time, we will be demonstrating that there is a business case for a transition to a low carbon economy. I think one of the biggest changes that's happened, certainly since Copenhagen COP15 6 years ago, but in an accelerated way over the last couple of years, has been the financial and economic evidence that those who are switching to low carbon, adopting energy efficient practices, clean lighting, smart vehicles, those who are taking up renewable energy, both at grid scale as we've seen in India, but also the companies, for example, those who've joined up to RE100, that they're doing it because it makes financial and economic sense to do so. And that evidence is now overwhelming. I mean, everywhere you look, there's an example of where clean energy, efficient use of energy, smart agriculture, smart cities are outperforming their peers. And that's the message we will be underlining at Climate Week, both because it's important in itself and because it contributes to the momentum towards Paris by giving governments the confidence that the ambitious targets we hope they'll sign up to are not detrimental to their economy. In fact, they're a catalyst for further growth and development in the future.
Of course, whatever is agreed in Paris later this year won't come into force until 2020, and we still need to be seeing some major emissions reductions before then. So how is that going to be achieved, and who are going to be the key actors?
Well, while you're absolutely right that the formal Paris Agreement won't enter into force, as is known, until 2020, almost all the countries that are going to be governed by this treaty, that's to say all the countries in the world, have set their own targets, whether it be for 2020, which many have done under a previous agreement, and then 25, 2026, 2030. So no sensible leader is going to be waiting until 2020 before getting the ball rolling on meeting those targets. And we've seen this already. I mean, Europe has its 2030 package. The US has committed to a certain number of policies, EPA regulations of power plants, fuel efficiency standards, and so on and so forth. And we're seeing this replicated all around the world. So there will be the ongoing implementation of policy at the national level. But perhaps more important, and this is where the Climate Group has been working ever since we started, is what are now called non-state actors, and by which we mean businesses, investors, regional governments and cities. And each of those over the last 2 years, those constituencies have been working on commitments, making new commitments, raising their level of ambition. Part of that has already been driving the Paris negotiations, but over the next 5 years, it'll be those actions that will determine whether we peak emissions or not. Given the momentum that's built up over the last few months, I'm very confident they will, although we need to spread that beyond the sort of the heartland of the OECD West and those companies, cities and states that are already well known for taking action. And our job at the Climate Group, along with many others in our space, will be to demonstrate the validity, the viability and attractiveness of those actions and have others follow suit. And so what we need over the next 5 years is a veritable movement of non-state actors making commitments, demonstrating the art of the possible, demonstrating the business case. And if that happens, and I'm confident it will, then we will peak emissions and they will fall inexorably thereafter.
We've seen emissions commitments, or INDCs, being made by many of the major emitters, the US, the European Union, even China. So there's a lot already on the table, but is it enough?
Well, I think it's unrealistic to assume that any countries are going to rewrite their INDCs. But I think there are a couple of things that we'll see that can happen that can make that process happen almost automatically over time. One, it's undoubtedly true that most countries have committed to things that they think are well within the realm of the achievable. I mean, if we take the example of China's commitment to peak emissions by 2030 at the latest, I have no doubt and have seen analysis to suggest that this could happen as much as 5 or 6 years earlier. The EU has committed to a target of at least 40% emissions reduction. And we've seen similar types of commitments from other countries. What that means is, to my mind, that as governments see that the cost of renewable energy continue to fall, that energy efficiency continues to make big business sense, not only for companies, but in terms of driving productivity. And after all, if one of the lessons or problems since the financial crisis has been that while there's been some economic recovery, productivity, particularly in my country, the UK, has not grown, energy efficiency as a driver of productivity will have a central role both economically and in terms of emissions reductions. So all those things will help countries not only restate their future commitments to be more ambitious, but actually, I believe, go beyond what they've already committed. So if we look at the INDCs as the baseline, the minimum effort, I'm convinced that through the actions of the non-state actors, through technology changes, through a better understanding of how financing of low carbon works, we will surpass those commitments.
You've previously spoken of the INDCs, the carbon reduction emission commitments, as being a kind of investment prospectus. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, if we think of how countries have currently presented their INDCs, a perhaps slightly cynical but maybe realistic way of looking at them is every country's put forward, in one way or another, the least it thinks it can get away with. Countries have to contribute something. They want that to be credible. They don't want to be shot down in the press. They don't want to be widely criticised. So they've put something forward that does contribute to reducing emissions over time, but is probably well within what they believe is possible. That's because there still remains, at least in some sectors of every country, a belief that cutting emissions has a detrimental effect on the economy, on economic growth. Despite the evidence that the Climate Group, first and foremost, but many other organisations have produced over the years to show that just patently isn't the case. And if we look at our States and Regions network, we see that time and time again, that the states and regions that are being ambitious are outperforming. So if you take climate action as an opportunity rather than as a threat to growth, then the INDC is, in a way of demonstrating these are the investments we require in our economy to shift from a higher to a lower carbon transition. Here are the opportunities backed by clear government policy, well thought through institutional frameworks, permanence through time, everything that investors want, and we would like you to invest in our country rather than someone else's country. So you create a positive competition. Rather like companies compete in financial markets for investors' money, countries can be doing the same. And that's not to say that they are having to go way beyond the ambition levels they've set themselves, but frame this as a way of attracting investment, whether it be from the private sector or from public funds or ODA or whatever combination that may be.
The Climate Group has said that if we do get a strong deal at Paris later this year, that we're going to see something of a Paris dividend, as it were. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, there are some very tangible benefits that could come from COP. If there is a sense, and this is something that may not be immediately tangible, but a sense amongst the investment community, amongst businesses and amongst governments that we are going low carbon, and the only question now is speed, then that opens up whole new opportunities for clean energy investment, but also really underpins that which is taking place already. Let's take the example of India, a country which we work in on distributed rural energy, but where there's of course also a boom in grid scale, utility scale, grid connected solar and wind energy. That sector is really blossoming at the moment, but an understanding from Paris that this is the direction of travel, whether you're in India or the US, that there will be a policy framework both internationally and backed up domestically, which will continue to support the rollout of renewable energy, will give investors the confidence that this isn't just a flash in the pan, people got excited for a couple of years, but this is the long-term game. And it's that long-term certainty. For a long time, many years ago, the phrase "long, loud, and legal" was coined to describe what investors need from climate policy to enable them to invest. And that's what the Paris dividend will be as a result of investors and business people believing we've got a long-term target. This isn't 5 years' work. This is 25 or 30 years worth of economic transition. It's loud. The incentives are joined up. They're front and center, and they're not being offset by perverse incentives. By what I mean is, with the one hand, you're subsidizing renewables, on the other hand, you're subsidizing fossil fuels.
Some critics would say that it's not possible to reconcile the goals of economic growth on the one hand with effectively tackling climate change on the other. Would you agree with that?
Number one, there are a growing number of cities, states, regions, and national governments that have not only managed to continue their economic growth while stabilizing or cutting their emissions. Many countries in Europe, for example, UK, Sweden, being good examples of countries whose economic growth has continued while emissions have fallen, Europe as a whole. But not only have they managed to do that, they've used low carbon action or climate action as a spur for the development of new economic sectors, new higher value added economic sectors that are now driving economic growth and innovation. Look at the wind energy sector, offshore wind in the UK, on and offshore wind in Denmark, renewables technologies across the board in Germany, in the US, now in India, an absolute surge in solar and wind energy, and in China, just across the board, development of new low carbon technologies, from electric vehicles to renewables to smart grid systems, are driving innovation and productivity. So there's plenty of both anecdotal and systematic evidence to show that that's not the case. Now, it would be foolhardy of me to say that all action to combat climate change produces a positive return, particularly in the short term. And I think it's that short, long-term issue that's important. The evidence from the Stern Review so over the last 10 years, shows that the costs of climate inaction, of doing nothing and hoping that we can adapt and respond to the impacts of climate change, the floods, the storms, the health epidemics, etc., are far, far greater than the cost of taking action. That's over the 30 to 50 year period. So any sensible cost-benefit analysis suggests that we need to take action. Second, there are lots of no regrets, what we might call preventive measures that we can take. Why on earth would we not invest in energy efficiency projects that have a return in 2 to 3 years, even if climate change proves to be a hoax? It won't be, but even if it were, there are lots of things we could do that would make sense from an economics perspective, from a health perspective. It's clear that much of the motivation for China cleaning up the energy sectors in its cities is to do with air pollution. when I was in China just last year, levels on the particular levels on the days that I there were 30 times the level of what's acceptable in Europe and the US. And there's a clear economic as well as social cost to that. So there are lots of reasons coming at different angles why it makes sense to take climate action, even in those cases where the financial benefits may be longer term than your average investor might be prepared to accept.
You spoke a little earlier about the very important role of non-state actors, in other words, businesses and state and regional governments, in delivering emissions reductions and growing the low-carbon economy. Typically, that's been the work of the Climate Group over the last few years. So what can we expect to see in future that's different?
Well, I think we address the work of non-state actors in different ways, which are complementary to each other. So one thing, working with partners, in one case, the Carbon Disclosure Project, we're creating reporting platforms that allow those non-state actors to set their ambition levels and report against them in a consistent, transparent way that enables them to compare their efforts, understand where they could go further, but also benchmark themselves globally. And so that's the sort of the baseline. And CDP do that already for corporates. We're working with them through our Compact of States and Regions to do that for state and regional governments. So one is giving a consistent framework of analysis and assessment. Second, providing platforms for those who wish to lead. Two initiatives, one that we have already, RE100, is designed to enable and encourage the world's most influential companies to commit to 100% renewable power. 100% renewable power, why? One, because that's what they will need to do if they're going to reduce their emissions in line with what the science suggests. Two, because if you're going to go 80%, you may as well go 100%. It's a commitment that people can understand. It's bold, it's brave, and it's easily communicable. And three, because renewable power, we've found from talking to the companies, the nearly 30 companies that have already signed up, that it makes financial sense for them to do so. Because it saves them money against future rising electricity prices, saves them the cost of hedging against electricity price volatility, gives them control over their energy. So those three factors together are both a sign of leadership on climate action, but demonstrating that leadership makes economic and financial sense. We're working currently on a similar platform to demonstrate energy productivity, energy efficiency leadership. And likewise, with our states and regional governments, we've created peer forums for them to innovate on policy, to go beyond just sharing best practice, which is a key part of our work, but to go beyond that, create new innovative approaches. And then a follow-on step from that, working both ourselves with our constituencies, but with our partners, is look at how do we integrate those things. So we know that cities, states, national governments all have important powers. They're not always very well coordinated, and they're perhaps not using those powers as efficiently as possible. So we're going to use Climate Week and beyond that, the COP in Paris, to start a dialogue process that will lead to more effective policy integration at different levels of government. But the private sector also needs to be part of that, because after all, most policy is designed to drive or change the direction of private sector investment. So one of the new things we'll be doing is far greater integration of those different sectors from a clear, well-developed baseline to develop innovative new policies that really drive low-carbon investment.
And finally, what's your message to the climate negotiators who are going to be gathering in Paris later this year?
Well, my number one message to those negotiators is do not fear that we cannot deliver the outcomes you commit to. In fact, the world, the business community, investors, subnational governments are ready, they're willing, and they're able. They just need you to set us a clear and ambitious sense of direction.
Thank you, Mark. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Please do join us again soon. From all of us here at the Climate Group, goodbye.